Imagine you're standing in the reception area of the San Diego Zoo on a perfect California afternoon. The sun is warm, families are laughing, and in front of you, separated only by reinforced glass, sits a 400-pound silverback gorilla named Winston. He's magnificent. His black fur gleams in the filtered sunlight, and his silver back catches your eye like a crown. Children press their faces against the glass, squealing with delight. Winston doesn't even glance at them. He's sitting cross-legged, methodically peeling a banana, occasionally looking up at the sky with what almost seems like boredom. He's gentle, calm, almost contemplative, a living embodiment of peaceful strength. Now, I want you to transport yourself 9,100 miles east. You're no longer in California. You're standing in the Virunga Mountains of Central Africa, at 200 meters above sea level. The air is thin and cold. Mist clings to everything. The temperature hovers just above freezing, even though you're practically on the equator. And through that mist, you hear it. A sound that makes your blood run cold. It's not a roar. It's deeper than that. It's a chest beat so powerful it reverberates through your ribcage. Boom, boom, boom. And then you see him. A silverback mountain gorilla named Guhonda. He's not sitting peacefully. He's not contemplating existence. He's charging. His eyes are locked on another male, a younger challenger who made the mistake of getting too close to his family. What happens next is violence so extreme, so calculated, so brutal, that the researchers who witnessed it could barely describe it in their field notes. Here's what you need to understand. These are the same species. Winston in San Diego and Guhonda in Virunga are both gorilla beringei. Same DNA, same evolutionary history, same biological blueprint. And yet, one sits peacefully eating fruit while tourists take selfies, and the other has killed 4 adult males in territorial disputes over the last 6 years. One is a gentle giant. The other is a warrior king who rules his territory with controlled violence. So here's the question that has haunted primatologists for decades. Why do gorillas become more aggressive the closer to the heart of Africa we go? What is it about the mountains of Central Africa? About Virunga? About Bwindi? About the equatorial highlands that transforms these animals into something fundamentally different? Is it the altitude? The isolation? The humans pressing in on all sides? Or is there something else happening? Something we're only beginning to understand? But what scientists discovered in 2019 changes everything we thought we knew about gorilla aggression. Because it's not just one factor. It's not just environment or genetics or social structure. It's a perfect storm of conditions that exist nowhere else on Earth. And when you understand what's really happening in those mountains, you'll realize that these gorillas aren't just aggressive. They're being pushed to the absolute limits of what their species can endure. And some of them are breaking. Let's start with geography, because if you don't understand where these gorillas live, you can't understand why they behave the way they do. There are 2 species of gorillas on Earth, Western gorillas and Eastern gorillas. The Western gorillas, gorilla, live in the lowland rainforests of Central and West Africa. They have relatively abundant food, sprawling territories, and lower population densities. They're generally less aggressive, more solitary, and their social structures are more fluid. But we're not talking about them. We're talking about the eastern gorillas, specifically the mountain gorillas, gorilla beringei, and their world is completely different. Mountain gorillas exist in only 2 locations on the entire planet. 2. That's it. The first is the Virunga Massif, a chain of 8 volcanic mountains that straddles the borders of Rwanda, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The second is the Bwindi Impenetrable Forest in southwestern Uganda. Combined, these 2 forest islands contain the entire global population of mountain gorillas. In 2024, there are approximately 163 mountain gorillas left on Earth. Every single one of them lives in these 2 isolated patches of montane forest. They're trapped. They can't migrate to new territories because those territories don't exist. They're surrounded on all sides by human settlements, farms, and roads. They're living on islands of green in a sea of humanity. And here's where it gets interesting. As you move from the western lowlands toward the Central African highlands, as you climb higher into the Virunga Mountains, as you get closer to the equator at elevation, something changes. The gorillas get bigger, they get stronger, their fur gets thicker and longer, and they get significantly more aggressive. In the lowland populations, serious fights between adult males are relatively rare. Most conflicts are resolved through intimidation displays, chest beating, and ritualized aggression that rarely results in physical contact. But in Virunga, in Bwindi, fighting is common. Violent encounters happen regularly, and deaths, both of adults and infants, occur at rates that would be unthinkable in lowland populations. So what's different? What is it about these specific mountains, at this specific elevation, at this specific latitude, that creates gorillas who are fundamentally more violent than their cousins just a few hundred miles away? The answer isn't simple, because there's something happening at 3,000 meters above sea level that transforms these gentle giants into something else entirely. Let me explain how mountain gorilla society works, because you can't understand their aggression without understanding their world. Unlike many other primates, gorillas live in stable family groups led by a dominant silverback male. The silverback isn't just a leader, he's everything. He's the protector, the decision maker, the father of almost every infant born in the group, and the absolute authority on all matters of daily life. His word is law. When he moves, the group moves. When he feeds, they feed. When he rests, they rest. And when he decides to fight, everyone's life is at stake. A typical mountain gorilla group consists of one dominant silverback, sometimes one or two subordinate males, usually his sons or brothers, multiple adult females, typically between 3 and 8, their juvenile offspring, and infants. The females aren't usually related to each other. Unlike many primates where females stay in their birth groups for life, female mountain gorillas leave their natal groups when they reach sexual maturity around 8 or 9 years old. They go looking for a new silverback, a stronger one, a more capable protector. Because in the world of mountain gorillas, a female's reproductive success depends almost entirely on choosing the right male. And this is where the violence begins. Because silverbacks don't just passively accept females into their groups, they compete for them, violently. When a young blackback male reaches around 12 years old and his back begins to turn silver, signaling sexual maturity, he faces a choice. He can stay in his birth group as a subordinate, living under his father's dominance, waiting for years or even decades for a chance to inherit the group. Or he can leave. He can become a solitary male, wandering the forests alone, desperately searching for females to start his own group. And when two silverbacks meet, when a solitary male encounters an established family group, when a younger male challenges an aging leader, the result is often catastrophic. The fights are brutal. We're not talking about the ritualized chest-beating displays you see in nature documentaries, where gorillas hoot and charge and then back down before anyone gets hurt. We're talking about actual combat. Silverbacks weighing 220 kilograms charging at each other at full speed. Canine teeth that are longer than a lion's, designed to rip through flesh. Bites that can crush bone. Attacks that last for minutes, with both combatants covered in blood. Chunks of flesh torn from their backs, hands, and faces. And here's what makes it even more terrifying. They know exactly where to bite to cause maximum damage. They go for the hands and feet, attempting to cripple their opponent. They go for the face and ears, trying to blind or disorient. And they go for the back and shoulders, where the massive muscles that give them their incredible strength are located. In 2017, researchers in Volcanoes National Park in Rwanda documented a fight between two silverbacks that lasted over 7 minutes. 7 minutes might not sound like much, but for two animals of this size, with this much strength, fighting with this intensity, it's an eternity. When it was over, the younger male had lost 2 fingers, had a deep gash across his face that exposed the bone, and limped away with what veterinarians later confirmed was a fractured femur. The older male, the victor, had wounds across his entire back and had lost part of his ear. Both animals were so exhausted, they could barely move for the rest of the day. This kind of violence is common in the Virunga Mountains, common in Bwindi, and virtually non-existent in lowland gorilla populations. And when a challenger appears, what happens next is so brutal that researchers had to stop filming, because the violence doesn't end with the defeated male limping away into the forest. Sometimes, it's just beginning. Because if a new silverback successfully defeats the dominant male and takes over a family group, the first thing he does, the very first priority, is kill the infants. Let me be clear about what I'm describing. This isn't accidental. This isn't collateral damage during a fight. This is deliberate, calculated infanticide. A new silverback who takes over a group will systematically hunt down and kill every infant and juvenile that isn't his biological offspring. He'll grab them, bite them, crush them, and sometimes throw their bodies. The mothers will try desperately to protect their babies, screaming, charging at the male, putting their own bodies between the killer and their children. But they almost never succeed. A determined silverback weighing 220 kilograms is simply too powerful. And the most horrifying part? The females know what's coming. Researchers have observed mothers grabbing their infants and running, trying to flee into the forest, trying to hide, trying anything to protect their babies from the new male. Sometimes they succeed, usually they don't. Why would evolution create a behavior this brutal? Why would natural selection favor males who murder infants? The answer is cold, calculated biology. A female mountain gorilla gives birth roughly once every 4 to 5 years. After giving birth, she enters a period of lactational amenorrhea, meaning she doesn't ovulate while she's nursing. She won't become sexually receptive again until her infant is weaned, which takes about 3 to 4 years. From a male's perspective, if he takes over a group full of females with infants, he faces a 4-year wait before any of those females can produce his offspring. 4 years is a lifetime in gorilla society. Another challenger could appear. He could be injured or killed. He could lose the group. So instead of waiting, he eliminates the competition. He kills the infants. And within weeks, sometimes days, the bereaved mothers come into estrus. They become receptive. And the new silverback mates with them, ensuring that the next generation will carry his genes, not his predecessors. This behavior has been documented repeatedly in Virunga and Bwindi. Dian Fossey, the legendary primatologist who spent years studying mountain gorillas in Rwanda, documented multiple cases of infanticide during group takeovers. Modern researchers using genetic analysis have confirmed that infanticide accounts for approximately 37% of infant mortality in some mountain gorilla populations. 37%. More than 1/3 of all infant deaths are the result of deliberate murder by adult males. Compare that to lowland gorilla populations, where infanticide has been observed, but occurs at far lower rates, sometimes as low as 10 to 15% of infant mortality. But infanticide is just the beginning, because there's a second type of aggression that researchers only documented in 2016, and it's somehow even more disturbing. It's called coalitionary infanticide, and it challenges everything we thought we understood about gorilla behavior. In 2016, researchers in Volcanoes National Park observed something unprecedented. A lone silverback approached an established family group. But instead of challenging the dominant male directly, instead of fighting for control of the entire group, he did something different. He coordinated with a younger subordinate male already in the group. Together, these two males attacked and killed an infant, not during a takeover, not as part of a dominance dispute, just pure, calculated murder. And when researchers analyzed the situation, they realized why. The subordinate male was the infant's uncle, but by killing his nephew, by removing that infant from the group, he increased his own chances of eventually breeding with the females once he reached full maturity. This was fratricide in service of future reproductive success. This is the world of mountain gorilla society. This is what happens when you compress highly intelligent, socially complex primates into shrinking territories with limited resources and intense competition. But here's what you need to understand. This level of violence, this frequency of infanticide, this willingness to kill even relatives for reproductive advantage wasn't always this common. Something has changed. And the reason these battles happen more frequently in Central Africa has everything to do with what humans did in the 1980s. In 1960, the Virunga Massif contained approximately 450 square kilometers of relatively continuous montane forest. Mountain gorillas could move freely between different volcanic peaks, could migrate to find food, could establish new territories if their current range became overcrowded. But then came the humans. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the human population around Virunga exploded. Rwanda's population density became one of the highest in Africa. People needed land. They needed farmland for crops, grazing land for cattle, space for their growing villages. And the easiest land to claim was at the edges of the forest, so they cut, they burned, they cleared. By 1990, the Virunga Massif had shrunk to approximately 430 square kilometers. By 2000, it was down to 410 square kilometers. And today, in 2024, mountain gorillas survive in just under 400 square kilometers of protected forest. They've lost over 11% of their habitat in less than 65 years. But it's not just about the total area, it's about fragmentation. The forests are now broken into isolated patches, surrounded by human development. Gorilla groups can't migrate between regions because roads, farms, and villages block their paths. They're trapped in their territories with no escape. And when territories are fixed, when groups can't move away from each other, when the forest can only support a limited number of families, the result is intensified competition. In 1970, The estimated density of mountain gorillas in Virunga was approximately 1-2 individuals per square kilometer. Today, in some protected zones, that density has climbed to over 3-5 individuals per square kilometer, nearly 3 times as many gorillas living in less space. Think about what that means. Imagine you're a silverback trying to maintain your territory, trying to keep your family fed, trying to protect your females from rival males. In 1970, you might encounter a neighboring group once every few weeks, maybe once a month. Your ranges would overlap slightly, but there was enough forest that you could usually avoid direct confrontation. But today, with 3 times the density, you're running into neighboring groups almost daily. Your feeding ranges overlap extensively. You're constantly encountering other silverbacks, other groups, other males who want your females. The tension is relentless, the stress is chronic, and the result is predictable. More aggression, more fights, more infanticide, more violence. Researchers at the Karisoki Research Center, founded by Dian Fossey and still operating today in the Virunga Mountains, have been collecting data on gorilla behavior since 1967. That's over 55 years of continuous observation, one of the longest-running wildlife studies in the world. And the data is unambiguous. Between 1970 and 1990, serious aggressive encounters between groups, defined as fights resulting in visible injuries, occurred at a rate of approximately 1 per 100 observation days. Between 1990 and 2010, that rate increased to 7 per 100 observation days. And from 2010 to 2024, it's climbed to 8 per 100 observation days. Aggression has more than tripled in just over 50 years. Infanticide rates have followed a similar trajectory, increasing from about 22% of infant deaths in the 1970s to over 37% today. But it's not just the shrinking forests. There's something in the mountains themselves that rewires their brains. Because you can't understand why mountain gorillas are more aggressive than their lowland cousins without understanding what it means to live at 3 meters above sea level on the equator. The Virunga Mountains aren't just any mountains. They're a chain of volcanoes, some still active, stretching along the western branch of the East African Rift Valley. Mount Karisimbi, the highest peak, reaches 507 meters. Most mountain gorilla groups live between 500 and 800 meters elevation, and at that altitude, everything is harder. The air is thin. At 3,000 meters, there's approximately 30% less oxygen available with each breath compared to sea level. For a 220-kilogram silverback who needs enormous amounts of energy just to move his massive body, this is a constant challenge. Mountain gorillas have evolved several adaptations to deal with this. Their lungs are larger relative to their body size than lowland gorillas. Their red blood cell counts are higher, allowing them to carry more oxygen in their blood, and their hearts are proportionally bigger, pumping more blood with each beat. But these adaptations come at a cost. Living in a constant state of mild hypoxia, of reduced oxygen availability, affects behavior. Studies in humans living at high altitude have shown that chronic hypoxia can increase irritability, reduce impulse control, and lower the threshold for aggressive responses. The brain, which requires enormous amounts of oxygen to function properly, operates in a state of constant mild stress. And when you're already dealing with intense social competition, when you're already facing pressure from rival males and shrinking territories, chronic hypoxia acts as an accelerant. It makes everything worse. It reduces your ability to regulate your emotions. It makes you more reactive, more volatile, more prone to violence. But here's where it gets even more interesting. In 2019, a team of researchers from the Max Planck Institute conducted a comparative study of stress hormones in mountain gorillas versus lowland gorillas. They collected fecal samples from both populations and measured cortisol levels, the primary stress hormone in primates. What they found was shocking. Mountain gorillas had baseline cortisol levels that were, on average, 43% higher than their lowland cousins. 43%. Even when not experiencing any immediate threat, even during peaceful feeding or rest periods, mountain gorillas were operating under chronic physiological stress. And chronic stress, in any primate species, including humans, is strongly correlated with increased aggression, reduced social tolerance, and impaired decision-making. And then there's the cold. Because what happens to a gorilla's body when temperatures drop to freezing changes everything. The Virunga Mountains, despite being located almost exactly on the equator, experience extreme temperature swings. During the day, when the sun breaks through the clouds, temperatures can reach 22 to 25 degrees Celsius. But at night, especially in the dry season, Temperatures regularly drop below freezing. Mountain gorillas have evolved thick, long fur to deal with this. Fur that's dramatically longer and denser than lowland gorillas possess. But even with that insulation, they're cold. They're burning enormous amounts of calories just to maintain their body temperature. And here's the critical connection. Thermoregulation, the ability to maintain stable body temperature, is energetically expensive. A mountain gorilla at 3.00 meters in near-freezing temperatures can burn up to 25% more calories per day than a lowland gorilla living in the warm, humid forests near sea level, just from thermogenesis, the production of body heat. This means they need to eat more, a lot more. But the vegetation at high altitude is less nutritious than lowland forests. The bamboo shoots, wild celery, thistles, and nettles that make up the mountain gorilla's diet are high in fiber but relatively low in calories compared to the fruits that lowland gorillas eat. So mountain gorillas face a constant energy deficit. They're burning more calories and consuming fewer calories simultaneously. What does this have to do with aggression? Everything. Because when animals are operating under energy stress, when they're struggling to meet their basic metabolic needs, they become less tolerant of competition. In 2021, researchers published a study examining the relationship between seasonal food availability and aggressive behavior in Bwindi mountain gorillas. They found that aggressive encounters between groups increased by 67% during the dry season, when food was scarcer, compared to the wet season when vegetation was more abundant. 67%. And even more telling, infanticide events showed a strong seasonal pattern, with 73% occurring during or immediately following periods of food scarcity. This makes perfect evolutionary sense. If you're a silverback operating on tight energy margins, if you're barely getting enough calories to maintain your body weight and keep yourself warm, you can't afford to share your territory with rival males. You can't afford to let a neighboring group encroach on your feeding range. And if you successfully take over a new group, you certainly can't afford to wait 4 years feeding and protecting infants that aren't yours while you slowly starve. So you become more aggressive, more territorial, more willing to fight, and more likely to kill. But there's a third factor, and this one is so counterintuitive that it took scientists 30 years to figure it out. It has to do with the gorilla's diet, but not in the way you might think. It's not just about calories, it's about what those calories consist of. Mountain gorillas, unlike their lowland cousins, are almost entirely herbivorous. They eat leaves, stems, bark, and shoots. Lowland gorillas, by contrast, supplement their plant diet with significant amounts of fruit, sometimes up to 67% of their diet during fruiting seasons. And fruits are high in simple sugars, providing quick energy. Mountain gorillas don't have access to fruits except during rare seasonal periods. Their diet is almost exclusively low-sugar, high-fiber vegetation. What does this mean for their behavior? In 2018, researchers at Duke University published a fascinating study examining the relationship between diet composition and aggression in primates. They found that species with high-sugar diets, those that consume significant amounts of fruit, tend to have more stable temperaments and lower rates of intraspecific aggression. The hypothesis is that regular sugar intake helps stabilize blood glucose levels, which in turn helps regulate mood and impulse control. Species on low-sugar, high-fiber diets, by contrast, experience more dramatic fluctuations in blood glucose, which can lead to irritability and aggression. Mountain gorillas, eating their low-sugar diet, are essentially experiencing chronic mild hypoglycemia compared to fruit-eating primates. Their blood sugar levels are constantly lower, more variable, and more difficult to maintain. And just like a human who hasn't eaten for several hours and becomes hangry, irritable and short-tempered from low blood sugar, mountain gorillas are operating in a state of nutritionally induced stress. Add this to the altitude hypoxia, the chronic cold stress, the high baseline cortisol levels, and the intense territorial competition, and you have a recipe for extreme aggression. And when researchers analyzed their feces in 2021, they found something that explained the sudden spikes in aggression that occurred seemingly randomly throughout the year. They found parasites, lots of parasites. Mountain gorillas, like all wild primates, carry a heavy parasite load. Intestinal worms, protozoa, bacteria, viruses. But what the 2021 study revealed was that certain parasites, specifically a genus of protozoa called Giardia and another called Cryptosporidium, showed strong seasonal patterns in mountain gorillas. During the wet season, when gorillas were drinking from streams swollen with runoff, infection rates for these parasites spiked dramatically. And here's why this matters. Giardia and Cryptosporidium are both gastrointestinal parasites that cause diarrhea, dehydration, and severe abdominal cramping. They make you feel terrible. They drain your energy. They interfere with nutrient absorption. And in humans, chronic infection with these parasites has been linked to increased irritability, mood swings, and aggressive behavior. The mechanism is straightforward. Chronic illness makes you feel bad, and feeling bad makes you less tolerant, more reactive, and more aggressive. But there's another class of parasites that's even more interesting: Toxoplasma gondii. This single-celled parasite, famous for infecting rats and making them unafraid of cats, so they get eaten and the parasite can complete its life cycle, also infects primates. And Toxoplasma does something extraordinary to its host's brain. It actually alters behavior. In rodents, it eliminates fear and increases risk-taking. In humans, chronic Toxoplasma infection has been correlated with increased impulsivity, reduced fear response, and yes, increased aggression. In 2020, researchers tested fecal samples from mountain gorillas across both Virunga and Bwindi and found that approximately 64% of all gorillas tested positive for Toxoplasma gondii. 64%. Nearly two-thirds of all mountain gorillas are infected with a brain-altering parasite that increases impulsivity and aggression. Now, we can't say definitively that Toxoplasma is making gorillas more aggressive. Correlation isn't causation, but the coincidence is striking. The most aggressive gorilla populations on Earth also have the highest Toxoplasma infection rates. Lowland gorillas show infection rates around 30 and 40%. Mountain gorillas, over 60%. And individual gorillas who test positive for Toxoplasma are, according to preliminary data, 28% more likely to be involved in aggressive encounters than uninfected individuals. But even parasites can't explain what happened in Bwindi forest in 2004, because that year, researchers documented something that challenged every assumption we had about mountain gorilla behavior. His name was Rukina. He was a silverback in his prime, approximately 18 years old, weighing an estimated 215 kilograms. And over the course of 26 months, from January 2004 to March 2006, Rukina killed 4 adult male gorillas. Not infants, not juveniles, adult males. Full-grown silverbacks and blackbacks. This is almost unheard of in gorilla society. Silverbacks fight. Yes, they injure each other. Absolutely. But they rarely kill each other. The fights are ritualized enough and the combatants intelligent enough that they usually end before anyone dies. One male submits, retreats, and lives to fight another day. But Rukina was different. Researchers who observed his fights described him as relentless. Where most silverbacks would break off an attack once their opponent submitted, Rukina continued. He would pin his opponent down and continue biting, continue tearing, continue attacking even as the other male screamed in submission. In March 2005, Rukina attacked a blackback named Mugeni during a border dispute between groups. The fight lasted less than 4 minutes. When it was over, Mugeni was dead. He had suffered catastrophic blood loss from bite wounds to his back, neck, and legs. He bled out in front of researchers who could do nothing but watch. What made Rukina different? Was he psychopathic? Can gorillas even be psychopaths? Researchers became obsessed with understanding him. They studied his behavior patterns, his interactions with his own group members, his feeding habits, everything. And what they found was disturbing. Rukina showed reduced affiliative behavior, meaning he spent less time grooming, playing with infants, and engaging in social bonding compared to other silverbacks. He was more solitary, more isolationist. He would often sit apart from his group, staring into the forest, seemingly lost in thought. And his aggression wasn't limited to rival males. He was unusually rough with the females in his group, occasionally striking them during disputes over feeding priority, something that's extremely rare in mountain gorillas. In December 2007, Rukina died. He was found by trackers, lying on his side near a bamboo grove. There were no signs of a fight, no injuries. He had apparently died of natural causes, though at 21 years old he was far from elderly. Researchers immediately called in veterinarians to perform a necropsy, an autopsy for animals. This was an extraordinary opportunity. Rukina had been one of the most violent gorillas ever documented. If there was something physiologically different about him, this was their chance to find out. And when veterinarians finally examined his body after his death, they they discovered something in his brain that might explain everything. During the necropsy, when the veterinarians removed Rukina's brain and examined it, they found significant abnormalities in the structure of his amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for processing emotions, particularly fear and aggression. The amygdala was enlarged, approximately 18% larger than expected for a gorilla of his age and size. Additionally, the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control and decision-making, showed signs of underdevelopment. The neurons in this region were less densely packed than normal, suggesting reduced connectivity and functionality. What does this mean in practical terms? The amygdala is essentially your brain's alarm system. It processes threats, triggers fear responses, and regulates aggressive impulses. An overactive or enlarged amygdala means you perceive more threats, react more strongly to perceived challenges, and have a harder time calming down once you're aroused. The prefrontal cortex, on the other hand, is the brake pedal. It's what stops you from acting on every aggressive impulse. It's what allows you to assess a situation rationally and choose a measured response instead of an explosive one. Rukina had a hyperactive alarm system and a faulty brake pedal. He was neurologically predisposed to violence. But here's the question that haunted researchers. Was Rukina born this way? Or did his environment create these brain abnormalities? We know from studies in humans and other primates that chronic stress, especially early in life, can actually reshape brain structure. Prolonged exposure to stress hormones like cortisol during development can lead to an enlarged amygdala and a smaller, less functional prefrontal cortex. It's called toxic stress, and it has permanent effects on behavior. Could Rukina have experienced some trauma early in his life, some period of extreme stress or violence that literally rewired his brain to be more aggressive? The researchers went back through decades of field notes trying to reconstruct Rukina's early life. What they found was suggestive but not conclusive. Rukina had been born during a period of intense instability in his natal group. When he was approximately 18 months old, his father, the dominant silverback, had been killed by a coalition of two younger males attempting a takeover. The infanticide that followed was particularly brutal. 3 infants were killed, though Rukina, being older and faster, managed to survive by clinging to his mother and fleeing into the forest. The group eventually stabilized under a new silverback, but those first few years of Rukina's life had been marked by violence, instability, and the traumatic loss of his father and siblings. Did that trauma reshape his developing brain? We can't know for certain, but the correlation is compelling, and it raises a terrifying question. How many other mountain gorillas are being shaped by similar experiences? How many young gorillas living in these compressed territories with high population density and frequent violent encounters are developing abnormal brain structures that predispose them to extreme aggression? Are we creating a generation of traumatized, neurologically altered gorillas? But genetics alone can't explain why aggression increased 340% between 1990 and 2020. Because brain structure is only part of the equation. Environment matters. And the environment of the Virunga Mountains has been changing in ways that directly impact gorilla behavior. We're talking about climate change. And what climate change is doing to mountain gorilla habitats is both subtle and catastrophic. Mountain gorillas depend heavily on bamboo. Bamboo shoots are one of their preferred foods, rich in protein and carbohydrates. During bamboo season, which historically occurred from July to October, gorillas would gorge themselves on bamboo, building up fat reserves that would help them survive the leaner months. But bamboo growth is exquisitely sensitive to rainfall patterns. Bamboo needs specific conditions to shoot. A wet season with consistent rainfall, followed by a brief dry period. When those conditions are met, entire hillsides explode with bamboo shoots, providing a feast for gorillas. But when rainfall patterns are disrupted, bamboo fails to shoot, or shoots sporadically, or shoots at the wrong time. Climate records from the Virunga region show that rainfall patterns have become increasingly erratic since the 1990s. The wet seasons are wetter, with more intense storms and flooding. The dry seasons are drier, with longer periods between rains. And the transitions between seasons, which used to be relatively predictable, are now chaotic. In some years, the wet season arrives weeks late. In others, it arrives early but then stops abruptly. And bamboo, which evolved under predictable rainfall regimes, can't adapt fast enough. Data from the Karisoke Research Center shows that reliable bamboo shooting, defined as at least 60% of monitored bamboo groves producing shoots in a given season, occurred in 89% of years between 1970 and 1990. Between 1990 and 2010, that dropped to 71% of years. And from 2010 to 2024, it's fallen to just 58% of years. In other words, gorillas can no longer count on bamboo season. What used to be a reliable annual feast is now an unpredictable lottery. And when bamboo fails, gorillas are forced to rely more heavily on less nutritious vegetation. They enter the lean season without the fat reserves they need. And stressed, hungry gorillas are aggressive gorillas. But there's another climate-related factor that's even more insidious: temperature. The Virunga Mountains, like mountain ranges worldwide, are warming. But they're not warming uniformly. A phenomenon called elevation-dependent warming means that high-altitude regions are warming faster than lowlands. Between 1970 and 2024, average annual temperatures in the Virunga Mountains have increased by approximately 1–2 degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much, but for animals living at the edge of their physiological tolerance, it's significant. Warmer temperatures mean that the vegetation zones are shifting upward. Plants that used to grow at 2,800 meters are now found at 3,000 meters. Plants that used to grow at 3,500 meters are now at 3,700 meters. And the gorillas, who have traditional ranges based on centuries of learned behavior, are finding that their territories no longer contain the same vegetation they're accustomed to. They're being forced to either move higher up the mountains into less familiar territory or adapt to eating different plants. Both options create stress and increase competition. And then there's the tourism. Because what happens when humans get too close is something no one predicted. Mountain gorilla tourism is a conservation success story. The revenue from tourists paying $1.500 per person for a 1-hour gorilla trekking permit has provided the funding to hire rangers, combat poaching, and protect the forests. Without tourism, mountain gorillas would almost certainly be extinct by now. But tourism comes with costs that we're only beginning to understand. To make gorillas safe for tourists to approach, researchers go through a process called habituation. Over the course of 2 to 3 years, researchers gradually acclimate a wild gorilla group to human presence. They start by observing from a distance. Then slowly, over months and years, they get closer. They make sounds to let the gorillas know they're there. They avoid direct eye contact. They submit to the silverback's authority. And eventually, if everything goes well, the gorillas learn to tolerate humans. They stop fleeing when humans approach. They go about their daily lives, feeding, playing, grooming, while tourists watch from 7 meters away. But here's the problem. Habituated gorillas have lost their fear of humans. And when you lose your fear of one predator, your fear response to other threats becomes blunted. Studies have shown that habituated gorilla groups are more likely to engage in risky behaviors. They spend more time in areas close to human settlements. They're less vigilant when feeding. And critically, they're more aggressive toward each other. The current hypothesis is that habituation reduces overall stress levels, which sounds good, but actually removes an important behavioral regulator. Fear, in moderate amounts, keeps animals cautious. It makes them avoid unnecessary conflicts. It makes them think twice before attacking a rival. But when you remove that fear, when you habituate them to the constant presence of potential threats without consequences, you remove that regulatory mechanism. Data comparing habituated versus non-habituated gorilla groups is limited because non-habituated groups are, by definition, difficult to study. But the preliminary data we have is striking. In a 2018 study comparing 2 groups in Bwindi, one habituated for tourism and one non-habituated, researchers found that the habituated group engaged in aggressive encounters with neighboring groups at nearly twice the rate of the non-habituated group. The habituated silverback was more willing to confront rivals, more likely to pursue fleeing opponents, and showed reduced submission behaviors when outmatched. But the most disturbing discovery came in 2022, when researchers found evidence of something unprecedented, something that, if confirmed, would overturn a century of understanding about mountain gorilla ecology. In September 2022, researchers in the Bwindi Impenetrable forest observed a silverback named Rafiki doing something gorillas don't do. He was eating meat, not by accident, not scavenging a carcass he found. He actively hunted, killed, and consumed a blue duiker, a small antelope species common in the forest. The observation lasted 11 minutes. Rafiki chased the duiker, cornered it against a fallen log, grabbed it with both hands, and delivered a fatal bite to its neck. Then he sat down and methodically ate approximately 40% of the carcass, starting with the organs, before losing interest and wandering away. This sent shockwaves through the primatology community. Mountain gorillas are herbivores, Their entire digestive system is designed for processing vegetation. They have the wrong teeth, the wrong gut flora, the wrong enzymes for digesting meat. And yet, here was video evidence of a silverback not just eating meat, but actively hunting for it. Since that initial observation, there have been 3 more confirmed cases of mountain gorillas consuming vertebrate prey. 2 involved blue duikers. 1 involved a hyrax, a small rabbit-like mammal. All 4 observations occurred in Bwindi. All 4 involved adult males. And all 4 occurred during periods of documented food scarcity, when bamboo had failed to shoot and other preferred foods were scarce. The debate in the scientific community is fierce. Some researchers argue this is a temporary aberration, a desperate response to unusual food scarcity driven by climate change. Others suggest it might represent the beginning of a dietary shift, an evolutionary adaptation to changing conditions. And a few, a controversial minority, suggest that this has been happening all along. We just weren't watching closely enough to see it. After all, we've only been studying mountain gorillas intensively for about 60 years. That's not even 3 gorilla generations. How much do we really know about the full range of their behavior? But here's what everyone agrees on. If mountain gorillas are incorporating meat into their diet, even occasionally, it represents a fundamental behavioral change. And behavioral changes of this magnitude don't happen in isolation. They ripple through every aspect of an animal's life. Because if gorillas are hunting, they're thinking differently. They're moving differently. They're interacting with their environment in a completely new way. And that might also mean they're interacting with each other differently. More aggressively, more violently. More like the chimpanzees, our other close relatives, who hunt cooperatively and are known for their extreme, often lethal violence toward each other. And this is where everything gets truly terrifying, because if they're changing their diet, what else is changing? What other behaviors? What other aspects of their social structure? What other elements of their psychology are being altered by the extreme pressure they're under? We're watching evolution in real time, but we're not just passive observers. We're the selective pressure. We're the force driving these changes, and we have no idea where it's leading. So what does all of this mean for the future? What does a more aggressive mountain gorilla population mean for conservation, for the gorillas themselves, and for the humans who share these mountains with them? Let's start with the immediate concerns. Human safety. Between 2000 and 2024, there have been 17 documented cases of mountain gorillas charging or making contact with tourists during trekking visits. In 5 of those cases, tourists were injured, though none fatally. The injuries ranged from scratches and bruises to, in one case, a broken collarbone when a silverback knocked a tourist to the ground during a bluff charge that went too far. These incidents are still statistically rare. Millions of tourists have visited mountain gorillas over the past 2 decades, and the injury rate remains well below 1%. But the frequency is increasing. In the 1990s, aggressive encounters with tourists occurred approximately once every 3 years. In the 2000s, that increased to once every 18 months. In the 2010s, once every 9 months. And since 2020, we're averaging an incident every 5 to 6 months. The trend is clear and accelerating. As gorillas become more aggressive toward each other, they're also becoming more aggressive toward humans. The impact on researchers and rangers is even more pronounced. These are the people who spend the most time with gorillas, who track them daily, who know them as individuals. And they're the ones most likely to be caught in the crossfire when fights break out. In 2019, a ranger in Volcanoes National Park was seriously injured when he found himself between 2 fighting silverbacks. He suffered multiple lacerations and a punctured lung from a bite that was almost certainly not intended for him. He was simply in the wrong place when a 220-kilogram gorilla lunged at his rival. He survived, but it took months of recovery. And the incident raised serious questions about safety protocols for people working in close proximity to increasingly aggressive gorillas. But the bigger concern is what increased aggression means for the gorillas themselves. Remember, mountain gorillas are critically endangered. There are only about 1,063 individuals left on Earth. That's it. Every single death matters. And if aggression continues to increase, if more silverbacks behave like Rukina, if infanticide rates continue to climb, if intergroup conflicts become more frequent and more lethal, the population could start declining. We've spent decades fighting to bring mountain gorillas back from the brink of extinction. In 1981, there were only about 254 individuals left. Through intensive conservation efforts, we've increased that number more than 4-fold. But that progress is fragile. And if internal violence starts killing gorillas faster than they can reproduce, we could see that progress evaporate. There's also the question of genetic diversity. With such a small population, every individual carries precious genetic variation. When violent males kill rivals, they're not just removing competitors, they're removing genetic diversity from the population. Over time, this could lead to inbreeding depression, where the lack of genetic variation makes the entire species more vulnerable to disease, less adaptable to environmental change, and more likely to suffer reproductive problems. The mountain gorilla population is already genetically bottlenecked from historical declines. We can't afford to lose more diversity. And then there's climate change. We've talked about how changing rainfall patterns and rising temperatures are creating stress that drives aggression. But those changes are going to continue and intensify. Climate models project that the Virunga region will continue warming at a rate of approximately 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade for the foreseeable future. Rainfall will become even more erratic. Extreme weather events, droughts, floods will become more common. The bamboo season will become increasingly unreliable, and the vegetation zones will continue shifting upward, eventually running out of mountain as the gorillas get pushed toward the peaks. At some point, possibly within the next 50-75 years, the montane forest ecosystem that mountain gorillas depend on may no longer exist in its current form. It will have shifted too far upslope, or the temperature changes will have been too extreme, or the rainfall patterns will have changed too drastically. And when that happens, mountain gorillas will face a choice: adapt or die. And if the behavioral changes we're seeing now, the increased aggression, the possible dietary shifts, are any indication, adaptation is going to be violent, chaotic, and costly. So what's the solution? How do we reduce aggression in mountain gorilla populations? The honest answer is that we don't know. We can't reduce human population density around the parks. Those communities were there first, and they have as much right to the land as the gorillas do. We can't expand the protected areas significantly. There's no political will or financial resources to relocate thousands of people. We can't control the climate or make rainfall patterns more predictable. And we certainly can't perform brain surgery on 1063 wild gorillas to fix their amygdalas. What we can do is continue studying them, continue collecting data, continue trying to understand exactly what factors drive aggression, and look for interventions at the margins. Some researchers have proposed supplemental feeding during bamboo failures, providing high-calorie food to reduce competition during lean periods. Others suggest reducing tourism pressure on highly stressed groups, giving them time to recover without constant human presence. Still others advocate for habitat corridors, thin strips of protected forest connecting isolated populations, allowing gorillas to migrate and reduce density naturally. But here's one thing scientists agree on, and it's something that should keep all of us awake at night. Because the truth is, we're not just watching mountain gorillas become more aggressive. We're watching what happens when you take an intelligent, socially complex species and push it to the absolute limits of what it can endure. We're watching what happens when you compress animals into shrinking territories, disrupt their food supplies, expose them to chronic stress, alter their climate, and then wonder why they're breaking. Mountain gorillas aren't becoming more aggressive because there's something inherently violent about Central Africa. They're becoming more aggressive because we've created conditions that make violence adaptive. We've created an environment where the calm, peaceful silverback who avoids conflict loses his territory to a more aggressive rival, where the male who hesitates to kill infants ends up waiting 4 years while his competitor's genes spread through the population, where the group that doesn't defend its feeding range with extreme prejudice starves during the dry season. We've created a world where violence pays, and the gorillas are responding exactly as evolution predicts they should. The mountain gorillas of Virunga and Bwindi are a mirror. They're showing us what we're doing to the planet, to its ecosystems, to the species we share it with. They're gentle giants forced to become warriors by the world we've created around them. And if we don't like what we see in that mirror, if we don't like watching these magnificent animals tear each other apart over bamboo shoots and shrinking forests, then maybe, just maybe, we need to change what we're doing. Because right now, at this moment, there's a silverback sitting on a volcanic slope in the Virunga Mountains. His back is silver, his fur is thick against the cold, and he's watching another male approach through the mist. In his brain, shaped by altitude and stress and trauma and 1,000 generations of evolution, a decision is being made: fight or flee, kill or be killed. And whatever he decides, whatever violence unfolds in the next few minutes, we put him there. We created the conditions. We set the stage, and now all we can do is watch and hope that somewhere, somehow, we find a way to give these incredible animals the peace they deserve before it's too late.